Welcome back to the podcast. As you know, I've been making a lot of podcasts about AI recently, and that's because I think there's a lot of important stuff to say about it. Some of the podcasts will be talking about the potential benefits of AI, and of course, quite a few the potential downsides. And I think there's a few important downsides to take into consideration here. It is possible that we're looking at the cusp of a total technological revolution. And from a psychological point of view, if we look at past technologies, we can see our brains are really, really vulnerable to new technologies as they emerge. And yes, that can include things like the internet and social media. And I think you can really make a strong argument that with AI, we're seeing a paradigm shift or a real step change. And so I love having the opportunity to talk to people about this subject. Today, I'm speaking with Jacob Ward. He's previously served as the technology correspondent for NBC News and Al Jazeera. He's been featured on podcasts like the Joe Rogan Experience, but also news programs like the Don Lemon Show. He was editor-in-chief of Popular Science, and he's the author of The Loop, How Technology is Making a World Without Choices, where he's critiquing the potential effect of AI on society. Today, we talk about various pitfalls of AI, such as becoming addicted to it, forming inappropriate relationships with AI software, becoming overly reliant on these tools in our day-to-day life and decision-making, how this technology can affect young people and our children and their ability to form new skills and to form basic human resilience. Jacob is a fascinating guest because aside from understanding technology really well, he also understands human psychology. He was the host of a PBS documentary called Hacking Your Mind, where he discusses just how much tech companies know about human psychology and how they exploit that to make their products more appealing. I'd be curious to get your feedback on these topics. Is AI something that you're worried about? Feel free to email us at thinkingmindpodcast@gmail.com. As always, if you like the podcast, do give us a rating or a review on whatever platform you're listening on. Share it with a friend, share it on social media. And similarly, do feel free to reach out to us if there are any topics you'd particularly like covered on the podcast in the realms of mental health, psychology, and self-development. As always, thank you very much for listening. And now here's today's conversation with Jacob Ward. Jacob, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm so pleased to be here. I really appreciate it. Do you go by, is it Alex, Alexander? What do you get called?
I go by Alex.
Okay, great. I don't want to call you what your mom calls you when you're in trouble. Yes, Alex. So nice to meet you, and thank you so much for having me.
It'd be great if you could give listeners a bit of an introduction to your work and your bio so we can get a sense of where you're coming from.
Sure. So I am a journalist. I've been a journalist for the better part of 25 years. I did a long time in magazines and then a long time in television. I was the editor-in-chief of Popular Science magazine, which is the first time that I began to bump into the topic of AI. It wasn't called that at the time. But we would cover back then the sort of fledgling researchers, mid-career kind of researchers who then went on to be the heads of AI at the major foundational companies like Meta and Google and the rest of them. And so I was covering those guys, when they were sort of in their 30s and proving themselves, right? And now they're all in their 50s and doing they're determining the future of how human beings make decisions, as far as I can tell. And so then I did about 10 plus years in television news, working first for Al Jazeera as their technology correspondent, and then for NBC News most recently. And I had a little stint in the midst of that where I did a PBS series called Hacking Your Mind. Here in the United States, PBS is our BBC. It's our public broadcaster. And we raised a couple $1 million from the National Science Foundation, federal funding, to do this basically crash course in how human beings make decisions. It would be very remedial for you, Alex, but for me and for our audience, I think it was a really breakthrough piece of programming. Because basically what we did is we went around the world and interviewed the top minds in behavioral science, Daniel Kahneman, Mahzarin Banaji, people who really sort of have established our understanding of how people make unconscious and instinctive decisions. And the whole point of that documentary was trying to show people that we make the vast majority of our decisions in an unconscious way, and that we are extremely predictable in how we make those choices. And again, for a behavioral, for any sort of therapist or psychiatrist like yourself, that's not a shock. But I think to your average human being, it's an incredible shock. I think we are raised, especially in the West, to believe that we are in charge of ourselves. And I certainly believe that. And then I did this documentary and learned that I was not in charge of myself at all. And I had this very powerful personal transformation. And then, from there, at the same time that I was learning about how so much of our decision-making is pattern-based and predictable, I was meeting all of these people who were starting to use the very primitive pre-ChatGPT kind of technology that the AIs that were, the AI technology that was available at the time, neural networks and deep learning and human reinforced learning, to try to predict human behavior and shape it wherever they could. And most of the time, or I don't know about most of the time, but a lot of the people who were willing to talk to me were people making very kind of paternalistic and positive products, things that would trick you into saving money or save you into quitting drinking or whatever, right? But I was also recognizing at that time, there is huge danger here in this group of people trying to make money by learning and predicting human behavior, and how incredibly predictable we all are.
Do you think these people are looking for and finding the exact principles that you uncovered in Hacking the Mind?
So what I found was that your average, let's say, Stanford Business School graduate or Stanford, computer science graduate has certainly had the opportunity to take a kind of 101, 201 level course in heuristics. And so most of the folks that I bump into in my work have a passing command of the work of Daniel Kahneman, the idea of thinking fast and slow, a system 1 and a system 2. And so on the one hand, you would think, well, that's good, because if anything, what I want is for the whole world to have a command of that kind of thinking. But what is scary about it is that they know just enough to get us all into trouble. Is basically what I've discovered, is that they are
to exploit our instincts.
That's right, to exploit our instincts, because they don't learn it in the interest of defending our instincts. They learn it in the interest of making their products as sticky as possible. And I had a particularly powerful experience that set me on the path of writing a book about all of this, which is why you and I are speaking. And that was a dinner party I went to in I want to say it was 2018, I think, 2017, could have been earlier, could have been 2016 actually. And I got to look back at my notes. But anyway, this was a dinner party thrown by a bunch of former behavioral science, typically graduate students, who would get together once a month in a group and read behavioral science papers, the latest findings, and be using that in their work, trying to build apps and trying to make those apps as captivating as possible. Are
these guys called, if I'm not mistaken, are they called social engineers? Is that the right term?
In this case, so there have been various terms around this, but in this case, they were calling themselves behavioral tech. B-Tech was the name of the name of the dinner group. I think that was an informal thing. I don't think that's something you would look for on LinkedIn anymore. But within the rubric of, it's either like UX design, people would call it, or growth hacking, or, in some cases, marketing. These are the sorts of folks that you find have a huge command, have a pretty handy command of this stuff. So at this dinner party, I'm sitting there, and they all know I'm a journalist, and I'm there taking notes, and I've told them ahead of time by email, this is going to be on the record. And nonetheless, there's this big presentation that these two guys give. They are newly minted PhDs from a big California university, and they are addiction experts. And they are explaining to this group, hey, here's how the circuitry of addiction works. And beyond that, here is how your brain rationalizes addiction. And beyond that, here is how, even when you know you are addicted to a thing, and have gotten yourself clean, the circumstances around you. They gave the example of, if you take people who were once addicted to cocaine and love doing cocaine in nightclubs, and you brought them back into a nightclub once they'd gotten clean, and you blast the music at them, and you flash the lights at them, and they smell the bar and the whole thing, and you bring them a tray, a mirror with lines of baking soda on it, and you say, this is baking soda, and then you ask them, how badly do you want to do this baking soda? These people will inevitably be like, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's an 11. All I want in the world right now is to snort that baking soda, right? And what these guys the point they were making was, our brains can be conditioned by our circumstances.
Cues.
Yes, by these cues to do all kinds of stuff. And then the brain will make up its own story for why it's doing that. Oh, I'm a nightclub guy, that kind of thing. And the point of their pitch was, we are a consultancy, and we will loan this expertise we have that we used to use getting people off drugs to get people hooked on your product. And the name of their consultancy, I kid you not, was Dopamine. They called themselves Dopamine. They about 2 months later got featured on 60 Minutes, and that was sort of the beginning of people realizing like, oh, this is a real problem, right? But for me, that was a moment where I just realized, oh, we're in a lot of trouble. A lot of trouble is coming, especially once AI gets in people's hands. And that's why I went on to write this book, The Loop, How AI is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back.
We'll get back to the podcast in just one moment, but first I just wanted to remind you guys I am doing a live event with Rose Cartwright. Rose, you guys might know, is an author and friend of the podcast. She is starting a new community called How Not to Heal, bringing people together for fun, interesting conversations about mental health. And the first event is scheduled for February 3rd, and it's called Mental Health Reimagined Beyond the Medical Model. She's kindly invited me to be a guest. And this is really why I started the podcast, to get to have interesting conversations with people about topics that I care about. And it doesn't get more enjoyable than having these conversations in person, where we can share ideas and move the conversation forward. Besides myself, there'll also be clinical researcher Ashley Murphy-Biner, who'll be talking about her experience with clinical research into magic mushrooms, OCD, and complex PTSD. We'll be talking about what we can achieve with the medical model as far as mental health, but also the limitations of the medical model, stuff that we've talked about quite a lot on the podcast. The event's going to be February 3rd in East London at 7:30 p.m. For a link to tickets, you can see the latest 2 episodes of the podcast, episodes 158 and 159. You'll find a link to tickets in the description of those. Bring a friend, bring a date if you want to. That would be an interesting second or third date. Definitely come with an open mind, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot of fun. I've been told tickets are selling fast, and it's just the last few remaining. So if you're interested, grab your tickets. And now, back to the podcast. That's fascinating. So you highlighted earlier that when you made Hacking the Mind, you uncovered these behavioral principles that made you realize that human behavior and our instincts are quite predictable. Would it also be fair to say that our instincts and behavior are often quite irrational as well?
Yes. I mean, what it certainly was, right? So one place that people like Daniel Kahneman, so Daniel Kahneman and his partner Amos Tversky, when they did their big work, right, they were psychologists, but their Nobel Prize, or at least Daniel Kahneman's Nobel Prize, was in economics, because this dovetails so clearly with the way that economists were realizing around that time that the models of how people make decisions and the ways that economists would model that decision making was based on the idea that everybody is a rational actor,
right,
and will make a rational choice.
Precisely,
And what Kahneman and everybody were showing, and this guy Richard Thaler at the University of Chicago, who is a behavioral economist, what they began to show is, oh, no, that's not how it works. People make incredibly irrational decisions. The weird thing is the reason these guys were so lauded is what they also discovered, though, is that our irrationality is in fact quite predictable, that you can understand typically in advance the kind of irrational decisions people will make. And once you understand that, the reason that was valuable to economists is that they could then work that into their calculations and figure it out as a confound in their studies, right? All of that. But yes, the discussion, what we've learned, right, is that human beings are deeply biased, deeply instinctive, and deeply short-term minded. We do not think about problems larger than what's around our campfire. instinctively. And that was the big lesson of it, is that we just don't handle abstract difficulty very well. We're only really very good at escaping snakes and picking fruit. That's what our brains are built for. As you know so well, our choices are entirely a product of the rewards we got out of our behavior in very ancient circumstances. And the whole point of hacking your mind is we go and speak to specialists in monkeys, and we go to speak to specialists in, ancient tribes, and learn in each of these cases that, like, what we are really built for is an ancient kind of survival. And the big breakthrough, right, that Daniel Kahneman and these guys all came out with was there's essentially this ancient, millions of year old ancient decision-making system that was designed to keep us alive. And that's what we use almost all the time in making our choices. But there is also a secondary system that's our much more newer, much more glitchy, or, very glitchy, very new decision-making system, which is what's allowing you and me to be sitting here dressed with, and prearranged to meet at this time.
Making good decisions.
Making good choices, not judging each other on our different accents, like being the kinds of modern, wonderful people we all assume we all are all the time. That's a very, very new thing, is what these guys have found. And the problem that I try to document in my work is everyone wants to convince you that you are that new, cautious, rational, reasonable person, that you are using your system too, your slow thinking brain, to make your choices, when in fact you are being played. And what everybody is trying to do, who's trying to sell you something, is trying to activate your ancient instincts, because it's way easier to sell stuff to somebody distracted and predictable than it is to try and sell to their cautious and creative self. And so that is I think the fundamental difficulty of our time, is that we believe we are, doing our own research and being our own, being our own, captains, when in fact we are being manipulated endlessly by our environment.
Have you ever watched the documentary Century of Self by Adam Curtis?
No.
So it's a BBC documentary by a British filmmaker, Adam Curtis, and he's basically highlighting the same thing you are, but instead of from a behavioral psychology perspective, from a psychoanalytic perspective. I find this fascinating because those two camps often don't get along, as listeners of the podcast will know.
I'm a total piker in this world. So tell me the difference between a behavioral take and a psychoanalytical take. What is the difference?
So behaviorists take things, as the name implies, at the level of behavior. So they're interested in what people do and what are like the obvious triggers and reinforcements that might trigger people to do one thing versus another thing. That could be like a positive reinforcement or a negative reinforcement. That's the way gambling works. Very, very useful, very powerful perspective. The psychoanalytic perspective, that's considered part of like depth psychology. So what are the unconscious things which might drive us to do the things that we do? So it's looking a lot more under the surface. So that's going to look at things. What do we think of? What makes up our ego? What do we identify with? What are the things that may have happened or not happened to us in childhood? I'm a fan of marrying these approaches. Ultimately, the reason I brought up this documentary is because in it, the Adam highlights that Freud was, coming up with these very powerful psychoanalytic principles, very much like we've been talking about, that people are irrational, that they behave unconsciously but predictably. And his nephew, Edward Bernays, used a bunch of those principles to come up with modern-day public relations and advertising. So Edward Bernays is the father of these fields and used a lot of these principles. So he's the reason why you might have an advert about a car that's not telling you about all the logical reasons you should buy this car. It's this fast or carries this many people. He's the reason why a car advert might have like a bunch of horses running next to it, or why you might have an attractive woman on the bonnet of the car, because you're appealing to the emotional mind rather than to the logical conscious mind. So very, very fascinating stuff. So is it safe to say hacking the mind is kind of the foundation for this book that you wrote, The Loop? How AI is creating a world without choices. So it's hacking the mind is outlining these principles, and now you're you're going on to write about how companies and products might take advantage of these things.
Yeah, and I was specifically worried, and I will tell you, Alex, I am no less worried today. In fact, I'm a little more worried that a world in which automated decision-making systems, AI systems, are available to everybody, are ones that are really going to, I think, play on the kinds of themes that we covered so much in Hacking Your Mind and that you have thought about so much on your show, right? The tendencies of human beings and our incredible predictability make us, I would say, the perfect control surface for something like AI, even inadvertently. I think that most bad behavior, most bad effects in this world don't result from an intentional strategy, but instead from a mistake, right, or carelessness. And I think that we are about to see an incredibly powerful set of results from some very big carelessness when it comes to just widely deploying a system that literally we are like, the whole takeaway for me, the big headline takeaway for me of the Hacking Your Mind experience, and I'd be curious to hear what you think about this, is that as human beings, we are built to outsource tough choices. We are made to outsource our decision-making to our emotions, to our environment, to people who look like us, and as a result put us at our ease, and in this case, to a seemingly omnipotent, deeply sycophantic commercial product that tells you you've got you're asking a great question and here's just the answer you're looking for. And that kind of technology and that kind of marketing of that technology, I think it's literally just right between the eyes of this instinctive decision-making system that turns out to govern so much of our lives.
Yeah, so one point I really want to zoom in on a bit is this sense that people don't really know what they're dealing with when they're talking to an LLM like ChatGPT or Grok or what have you. So, as you said, you get the impression that you kind of get the impression you're talking to a person or a sentient, intelligent being of some sort. Maybe you could tell us as a technology journalist, what is a large language model? What are we actually dealing with? What is the software doing?
So really all that it is, the way I describe it is it is an extremely, it's a parrot with an infinite memory, right? Is one way to think about it. That's not quite technologically what it is, but what it's essentially just doing is vacuuming up as much human writing, in this case, so with something like an LLM, and if you're just typing with it, what it has done is vacuumed up all the writing it can possibly come up with, all the human writing it can possibly come up with. And then it has done the math to say, when this kind of thing when these words are together, typically these words are put together with it. And when these words are put together, these kinds of words are put with it in this kind of order. And what these companies have figured out how to do is how to create they've refined the learning of that system. And learning is a misnomer because it's not really learning anything. It's just picking up the mathematical patterns in the language. But based on what it knows around these words tend to go with these words, these letters tend to go with these letters, it has extrapolated to a point where it can do an incredible imitation of human communication and
thought
human
patterns.
Thought. Yeah, it looks to us like it is thinking and communicating its thoughts, when what it's really doing is regurgitating habits that it has seen, patterns that it has seen in past examples of similar pieces of language from the past. And so the difficulty, right, is that our brains can't handle that. Our brains can't draw a distinction between those things. There's a famous, your listeners may already know the story, and so forgive me if they do, and forgive me if you do. But there's this guy, Joseph Weizenbaum, who's the story of Joseph Weizenbaum is a big sort of piece of the iconic mythos in my world. In the 1960s, he was doing work at MIT. He was a early computer scientist. And he built a teletype machine that posed as, well, he was trying to figure out what to do with it. He was trying to get people to play with it. Basically, it would pretend to talk back with you. It would converse with you through typing. And it was very simple. It was really just kind of mirroring your language. Really, it was following a flow chart. I mean, it was incredibly primitive, but very sophisticated in terms of what he was doing with it. And what he did was he was trying to figure out, how am I going to get people to play with this? And so he dressed it up as a therapist. He dressed it up as a Rogerian therapist, which, as your listeners will know, is like, men are driving me crazy. Why would you say men are driving you crazy? Well, you know how men are. Tell me how men are, right? It's just reflecting your.
It's imitating active listening.
Yeah. It's all it does. It's literally all it does. So he first deploys it on his secretary. This is the famous story, is that he deploys it on his secretary, and she turns around and says to him, within 5 minutes, she's like, I need you to leave the room. I can't have you here listening to this conversation. This is about to be an extremely personal conversation. And within like a few years, the American Psychological Association was talking about the end of human therapy. They were predicting the rise of robot therapists. Carl Sagan was on TV saying we were going to do therapy in a phone booth from now on. And, it just went crazy. And what's really interesting is Weizenbaum quit the field. He was so horrified by what happened and how gullible human beings are in the face of something like this, that he said, this is an irresponsible thing to be playing with, and I'm out of here. And he spent the rest of his life as a climate activist and died in the 90s. And the thing that's so deeply depressing about that story is that I tell that story, it's now a really widely known story. But when I tell that story I used to tell that story to like a group of business students, and they would say, well, geez, they'd laugh and they'd say, why did he quit the profession? He had a great minimally viable product, which is the term that Silicon Valley people use for a prototype you can start shipping, right? That's the lesson from the modern era of business maker. And now, some of the company after company after company is now trying to create a robot therapist, which is why here in the United States we even have some laws being passed saying you can't have AI do therapy. It's not okay. But it speaks to how even the most primitive form of this, and I would argue we are also currently dealing with the most primitive form of the technology. It's about to get way more sophisticated. But even at this very early stage, it is absolutely causing people to turn over their decision making. Volunteer incredibly private questions about their life, and in some cases come to believe that this system is some kind of guru that has the answers to life's mysteries. There are many, many, many documented cases now of people having fully, deep emotional attachment to these systems that are literally just language imitators.
Deep emotional attachment. There are cases of people marrying chatbots. And there are also, cases of someone with psychosis or psychotic symptoms, and those being exacerbated by using chatbots. And I'm sure there are cases of completed suicide, which have been spurred on by chatbots. So it's all incredibly worrying. Funnily enough, I did know that story of that primitive version of the AI, Rogerian therapist. I knew it because of a different Adam Curtis documentary, not Century of Self, which I mentioned before, but another one called Hypernormalization. I would urge you to watch these documentaries. I think they're very.
Man, I got to know more about this guy. I'm the kind of self-loathing journalist who both deeply admires other people's work and is deeply jealous of it. So I always have the hardest time with other folks in this world. But yeah, that is there's example after example of. As just the ways in which we so quickly say that this system we don't understand must be incredibly sophisticated. This is the basis of anthropomorphism, right? It's the basis of superstition. It's the basis of all kinds of things. And it is about to, I think, grab us all by the neck.
Yes. And in terms of how should we be thinking about the leaders of these AI companies, people like Sam Altman and the like? From what I can tell, I'm not necessarily worried that they have, as you may have implied earlier, actively nefarious aims. But I just worry a huge amount about second and third order effects. So Facebook is a great example, or introducing the like button in Facebook or the retweet button on Twitter. No one introduced those because they wanted to achieve some terrible outcome. And yet when we play with human technology at scale, bad things happen. Is that how you view these people, or how do you see it?
I think that so first of all, I don't believe that they are fundamentally nefarious. I would argue Elon Musk is the first person that I've encountered in a position of billionaire authority who really does seem to have some fundamentally destructive impulses. He likes to kind of troll democracy in a way that I've never seen before. So
something dark seems to be happening there.
Yeah, he is a very dark example, and I'm glad that he is the outlier. That said, all these guys are on the same text thread. They're all WhatsApping with each other. They're all using Signal to talk to each other all the time. So it's not as if they all go skiing with each other. So it's a weird thing. But he's an outlier. I would say the vast majority of these guys, in my experience, are very thoughtful. They tend to get into the work because they believe they can make a very powerful and positive change in the world, and they become very devoted to that change. What also, though, a couple of things tend to happen, or I'd say there are three factors that I think are really valuable to understand. The first is, in the case of like all of these guys come up through software. So the dictum of software, the lesson of being in the software industry is that scale solves your problems. That the more people you put this thing in front of, the more you're going to iron out the kinks in it. And the process of doing so can be a little ugly, but it's worth it in the end because on the whole, you get a very positive user case for your average human being, right? What that means, though, is that they become very insensitive to what we would call the edge cases, or what they would call the edge cases. So the case in which someone develops a psychotic attachment to a chatbot or completes a suicide while speaking to it, which are all the subject of lawsuits in the United States now, is considered an edge case. And you'll speak to people in tech who say, well, that's a tiny percentage of the total. And so it's not as big a deal, right? And you can't expect us to be responsible for that. And we can come back to that question in a second. I have a couple of anecdotes I can tell you that sort of illustrate about that. So that's one factor, is this idea that scale solves your problems and the edge case doesn't fundamentally have to matter all that much. Another big one is this belief that I think fundamentally these are folks who wind up in an environment where keeping the entity, the institution, the company going becomes its own purpose, and the company's existence becomes a kind of taken for granted center of gravity that becomes sort of inarguable. And so whenever anyone suggests, well, why does this have to exist? That's a ridiculous question to people who work inside these companies. And so
why does it have to be OpenAI that's the AI winner, right, as opposed to any other company?
That's right. I've asked people this: why do you think it should be you? Or why are you personally so crucial to this effort, or whatever? They can't even answer these questions because it is so fundamental to their worldview that. I have a friend who says that a lot of people in Silicon Valley are like, I don't know if this reference is going to make any sense to you, but are like your friend who watched Akira too many times and didn't quite understand it. So Akira, the manga, is all about superpowered people and how it goes terribly wrong when they develop these superpowers. And if you watch that movie and misinterpret it, you might think that the lesson of the movie is that superpowers are really cool to have, where in fact the lesson of that movie is, power corrupts and everyone suffers, and so it really sometimes feels like the sort of, there's this belief that like being at the top of the heap, being, that you're sort of the main character and that the other characters are just kind of background actors. It's a common thing in Silicon Valley to refer to people who don't matter as non-player characters, NPCs. So that's another thing. There are people who count and people who don't. And then the third thing I would say that is a growing problem, and is one thing that I didn't see coming when I wrote this book. So this book I wrote, and it came out about a year before ChatGPT did. So I was really speculating about what a lot of this was going to be, and I just turned out to be, I happened to be right. One of the things I didn't see coming was this near religious zealotry that we've seen on the parts of Altman and these others to get to a fabled promised land in the future where AI makes a perfect utopia for us, and that it's worth the upending of society to get there, and the destruction of millions of jobs and whole industries to get there. And there is a very clear feeling that all of this stuff is worth it to get to that other side, which in any other industry would be not just unacceptable, but, unethical and possibly illegal, right? To think of it that way. So this is the zealotry of this leadership is something I wasn't quite ready for.
Yeah, and certainly his utopian thinking does not have the best track record, historically speaking.
It's pretty rare. It's rare to find one that worked out okay. That's exactly right.
So in terms of any individual listening to this, what would your pitch be to them in terms of what they should be worried about when engaging with an LLM like ChatGPT, or perhaps engaging with it too much or in a particular way?
Well, I think that we're going to see a huge amount of addictive behavior pop off when it comes to, these systems are like one of the lessons for me of the 5 years I spent writing this book and the years before that I did of reporting was one of the big questions I just asked throughout the reporting was, is there anything about humanity that can't be simulated by an AI system? That can't, analyze it and replicate it in some form? And the answer, unfortunately, I think I'm finding is no. There's almost nothing in the fundamentals of what we take pride in as humans, and that's art, humor, sexual attraction, the charm, right? These are things that you like to think are kind of ineffable and human and irreplaceable and unsimulatable, but it turns out they're very simulatable. And so one of the things that I sort of try to, I struggle with this myself, as everybody does, is being drawn in by the sycophantic quality of these systems. They're constantly praising you for the questions you're asking and the path that you're on. The capacity of these things to create incredibly lifelike imagery, and the combination of using these things. And again, we're at a very primitive stage where you can't make a 90-minute movie out of this stuff yet. You're going to be able to soon, but not yet. It's just faithful enough to real human experience that I think it is, that no one is immune to being drawn in by it more deeply than they intend. So, and unfortunately, at least in the United States, we don't have any rules about how these companies are allowed to deploy this stuff on us, and that's because in the U.S. we have a long history of being very hostile to the notion that we are manipulatable. We regulate against death and we regulate against financial loss, but we don't like to regulate against things like manipulative behavior. And so, and this is, I think, the most manipulative kind of technology in terms of its ability to simulate human experience. So I'm dancing around the answer to your question because I what is the solution to that? I mean,
not the solution, but if someone uses the software too much, what's going to happen to them? What would be your main worry?
Right. So my main worry is that you're. I mean, a couple of things I worry about. The first is your brain wants someone else to make its choices. That is it's how we're built. And so the more you let this thing tell you, hey, this is what you should do, the less, I think your agency is a muscle, and the more that muscle is going to atrophy, and your ability to actually make a choice for yourself or make a plan for yourself and write it down is going to be that capacity is going to shrink and shrink and shrink over time. So that's the thing that I really worry about. Another one is your social expectations about how you get treated by people in your life. When you have a sycophantic system ready to flatter you all the time and engage and be incredibly responsive and productive with you, and that's the most like safe for work version of that, right? You've got teenagers now with systems that where they can make a whole girlfriend persona. I'm thinking here of like young men, right? Make a whole girlfriend persona. The system can you can ask for endless pornographic images of that person, and then you can ask the chatbot to start talking to you as that person, and before you know it, you've got a kid fully addicted to a kind of online pornography that we've never even considered before now. And talk about a muscle that's atrophying. Your ability to tolerate, an actual real life human being that you might otherwise have a romantic connection with, but you can't deal with them because they're not constantly available to you and constantly praising you and incredibly, pornographically perfect. How are kids going to develop the ability to be connected with other people? And I've worried about this out loud with lots and lots and lots of people, and sensitive people and practitioners like yourself recognize that that's something we have to really grapple with as a society. But I have other people saying, it's going to be a Darwinian thing, and those people get kind of winnowed out, and that's hard. Like I think this is going to test our capacity as a society to recognize and help people with unconscious choices that AI is going to foist on them.
No, I mean, I really resonate with all of those concerns. And the main thing I would want to highlight from that, which I really worry that most people don't understand, is your mind is absolutely a muscle. Your mind is not like a static entity, like a computer, which basically preserves the same capacity over time. It will gain or lose capacity depending on your actions, especially what you repeat over time. And it's going to be your ability to make decisions, your ability to think, your ability to deal with things which make you anxious or uncomfortable, your ability to connect and socialize with people. All of these are skills which can be trained up if you practice them intentionally. And I'm a huge advocate of that, obviously. And anything that can... we can talk later about how maybe we can use these technologies sensibly, but anything that takes you away from these vital processes too much, it was going to cause them to atrophy for you. And, I've had patients and clients who have trouble getting out of the house, have trouble socializing, feel very anxious, don't know how to deal with their anxiety. So this is here probably going to get worse. So it's just something I very much worry about as well.
I think the epidemic of loneliness that we're going to see based on this is going to be very, very difficult and powerful. So let me ask you this question, because this is the thing that I keep coming down to. I'm constantly asked, what can we do about this? And one of the illusions that I think a lot of companies like to perpetrate is that it's somehow on you individually to change your behavior and pull yourself out of this. There's a kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps attitude on the part of people who are making the systems that in many cases are causing these problems, right? So it's a very cynical thing. But where do you come down on the idea that a human being can individually, in the face of something like this, shift their behavior and get to the right place versus the need to regulate, on some societal level, or at least a national level, against the effects that we're talking about here?
That's a good question, and I'm a little bit biased because I deal with individuals and all of my work is with individuals. I tend to think about things on an individual level, and a lot of my audience are the kind of people who like to think about their lives and what can I do in my life to make my life better or to quell certain harms. In general, I think the more we propel into modernity and life gets stranger and stranger and more distant from, let's say, our hunter-gatherer past, the way it's panned out, the greater onus there is on the individual to do things proactively, to try and keep things from getting too dysfunctional. So a classic example is like food and diet and stuff like that. We live in a really weird food landscape now where we have access to foods which are cheap and full of calories and lacking in nutrition. As of now, it's largely the onus is on the individual to make sure, okay, I'm not going to eat junk food. I'll eat junk food 10% of the time, not 80%. I'm going to put all this good stuff in my diet. I'm going to go to the gym, which the gym would be such a absurd concept to our ancestors, who would be like, you go to like a box and you would intentionally expend energy for no reason, but we have to.
You pretend to fire a bow. Yeah. Just right. Simulate it.
So for many things, including AI right now, the onus is on the individual. Do I think the onus should be on the individual? Ideally not, because some people we just know are more agentic. They're higher in a personality trait called conscientiousness, say, or even openness to experience, which might allow them to encounter self-improvement type ideas in the first place. So some people are just predisposed to be better at this kind of thing, stemming the tide and being proactive. And some people are worse. So I do think this is where I'm outside of my expertise when it comes to government policy and regulation. But my intuition is that some kind of regulation would be required, as we're starting to see in the food industry, as we've seen with other things like, tobacco, certain recreational drugs. We can argue about how those kinds of policies should be carried out. But I do think some sort of more widespread regulation does make sense when we're dealing with technologies which, as we've outlined already, are so seductive to human nature and to our instincts. Is that where you land on this?
Well, I'm very much so. I'm actually quite cynical about individual onus. I think that our ability as human beings to resist this stuff is pretty limited, and as you say, pretty segregated. And I say this not because I'm at the top of that heap. I say this because I'm at the bottom of that heap. Like one of the takeaways for me of doing that documentary Hacking Your Mind is that I had to quit drinking. I realized very quickly, here's a form of behavior I am totally powerless over and had not understood about myself. And I'm discovering in my interactions with AI that there are all kinds of interactions that I have with this thing that I am very seduced by and find myself totally powerless in front of it. And I wrote a frickin' book about this, so I don't in any way cover this stuff because I'm trying to sort of speak down to people that I think have lesser capacity than I do. So that's one thing. The other thing I guess I would say is that but I guess what I'm interested in finding out from you is do you believe, one thing I've taken some comfort from is the idea that's a popular one in Alcoholics Anonymous in AA, which is the opposite of addiction is connection. Right, that the more isolated you are, the worse you're going to do in your efforts to be agentic and have conscientiousness and so forth. And so, if anything, I think if we're going to regulate anything, it is the tendency of a technology to drive people into isolation. I would like to, in some way, be throwing big institutional resources at bringing people together more. And I don't know quite what that even looks like. It sounds very socialist, but I think it probably is, and so, but on an individual level in a capitalist democracy, do you think that, at least with the care of a practitioner, you can pull people out of some of this seduction?
I think people can be pulled out of it. And I agree with you that I think connection is a big part of the answer. And I also think a big part of the answer is like education and culture. I think when it comes to like getting someone to do something, I think encouragement and positive reinforcement is probably going to be better than force. And when people live a life that's like holistically appealing and fulfilling and satisfying, I agree 100%, they're going to be much less likely to fall down the traps of using these technologies. So I think in the same way we've come to understand in the past 50 years, say that cigarettes are bad for us and will cause lung cancer, we need to understand at a really concrete level, like socializing is mandatory. It's not an option. Community building is not a luxury that should be talked about only by the wealthy or the people who have reasonable working hours. Like there are certain things which we don't necessarily think of as mandatory for psychological health that we need to start thinking of as mandatory. And socializing is one, exercise is another one, having like some sort of sense of meaning or fulfillment, and definitely avoiding excessive isolation. So my hope, and I guess my optimism, is we're just simply going to become a better educated, more mature society with a certain culture of understanding what we need as human beings. And I do think we're getting there, because in the public conversation, not just on, one podcast, but on many, many podcasts, these conversations are happening. So that would be my main source of optimism, is that we can actually wake up as a society. As you can see, we have done in the past. Many things are better now. Working conditions, for example, might be a good example, especially among young people, are much better now than they were 100 years ago. So I'm hopeful that things will continue to improve in that vein.
Yeah. The other thing that makes me hopeful is the attitude of young people toward a lot of this stuff. For one thing, young people don't have, my generation's allergy to speaking about their mental health challenges openly, right? The nice thing about the rhetoric in circles of people in their early 20s these days is they very openly are talking about, their addictive impulses and their, and brain rot, and all of that stuff is very openly discussed. And I'm very pleased by that. That is a good thing. I also think that they are having increasingly a kind of a very powerful allergic reaction to this stuff. There's a great term going around in the United States. I don't know if it's made its way across to you yet, but where young people refer to AI and to older people who use AI too much as clanker. A clanker is somebody who's kind of doing it too much, or, look at this clanker trying to convince me it's my mom, or whatever it is. So that's great, right? And I think that there's a good cultural rejection that at some point is going to sort of that is already rearing its head, and I take some comfort from that. But I just think that this line that somehow we're gonna be able to do it ourselves is not adequate to this task when you have the best capitalized, smartest people in the world suddenly working to foist this stuff on us.
No, I don't. I totally agree. And we know, even, technologies besides AI, just like social media, Instagram, many people are addicted to those and can't take their eyes off their phone. That's a huge problem. One prediction I made on the podcast I did with Sophie McBain a few weeks ago, which is also about AI, is that in the future, the best schools educating the richest among us will use actually very little technology relatively and concentrate on pens and paper and thinking.
We've already seen this, right? I mean, the titans of Silicon Valley, their kids go to these Waldorf, schools in the woods. I mean, there was a article recently about Mark Zuckerberg and the cohort of
right
families that he had assembled in Silicon Valley around his little compound. Were running an unlicensed school for the kids, and there's a whole controversy around whether he was allowed to be running this school. But these are kids, in off the grid, learning, problem solving and so forth in that way. So I think you're absolutely correct. I think that it is going to be the automating of education that falls heaviest on the most underserved communities and the people who actually learn, and I think this is going to be true also of things like, an experience of art or an experience of music, right? The ability to actually see somebody perform something in real life, have a tangible, physical, social experience will also be reserved for the rich if we're not careful. That's right.
Yeah, and can you imagine the nightmare of the emergence of a class of people who know how to think and can use their minds, and a kind of underclass of people, even if it's not the majority of people, can you imagine an underclass of people who don't know how to think because they're too addicted to technology? It's very terrifying.
I mean, I've already interviewed people. I interviewed a woman who was using a chatbot as her romantic companion. That was her steadfast emotional support system. And, it's easy to roll your eyes at that person. But when I spoke to her at length and learned a little more about her life, she's working 2 jobs at the airport. She sleeps like 5 hours a night. She's got no time for an actual human relationship. And the men in her life suck anyway. So she just, she's just not, so it felt to me like that sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps idea doesn't apply to somebody in that circumstance. It is her economic circumstances as much as anything else that's driving her into this kind of dependent relationship. And that's, I think, people like to say, well, people are going to behave the way they're going to behave. No, people are going to behave the way that their environment allows them to behave. And that's what we're seeing.
Yeah. And of course, that's a dynamic process too, because the more people become addicted to these technologies, then the ever more vulnerable they are to more technology in the future. Like you could make the argument that someone who is addicted to social media is more likely to become addicted to and dependent on AI, and then they might be more likely to become dependent on future iterations of AI as their skills and their mental skills atrophy in the way kind of we described earlier.
It's a crazy finding that just came out the other, right before Christmas. There was a paper that came out at a conference called NeurIPS, which is the big kind of academic AI conference that happens every year. And this group, it was a consortium from a bunch of big universities in the United States, created this paper. I can't remember the subtitle of it, but the title of it was Artificial Hive Mind. And what they basically were doing was they took a bunch of open-ended creative prompts, tens of thousands of them, and threw them at about more than 70 different LLMs, and basically asked these LLMs for these sort of creative projects. And what was so disturbing is that what they discovered is each individual LLM over time was offering us a narrower and narrower band of responses to these creative requests. And across the 70 LLMs, those responses tended to converge on one another, so that over time you're getting a less and less diverse set of responses. So you ask it for, a poem about time, these 70 LLMs are much more likely to fall into a cliche like time is a river, than they would come up with something new and original. And what these writers are basically warning about is, a threat to pluralism, a threat to the diversity of thought that we get out of human beings, because people are going to, over time, say, oh, I'll spend some time with Claude because I've been stuck on OpenAI's at ChatGPT all this time. If I switch LLMs for a little while just to get a little diversity of perspective, that'll sort of freshen things up. Turns out, no. In fact, being on any of these LLMs is going to keep you in a smaller and smaller, a shrinking circle. I mean, this is why I call the book The Loop, a shrinking circle of choice. And we are starting to see that already.
And do they have any idea why that happens? Is that because the models are based on prediction? Is that why?
Yeah, they're all just greatest hits medleys, right? They're just using the greatest hits of the past. They're not, what everybody has pointed out time and again is like, if we, let's say that Hollywood suddenly decided that they were only going to use AI from now on to entertain us all, which many of them would like to do, right? We've seen Bob Iger strike a big deal with the head of Disney strike a big deal with ChatGPT, $1 billion deal with ChatGPT. If that goes, if movies only used AI to make stuff, you would never have a new actor again. You'd be watching movies starring Harrison Ford and Tom Hanks for the rest of eternity, because there's nothing new. There are medleys of existing people.
Or it might be an amalgamation of different.
Yeah, an amalgamation of people, but you aren't good. But the ingredients are limited, and that overall creative thought is the problem we're going to face, is that if we just rely on these systems, nobody's going to do anything weird and new. It's just going to be a kind of rehashing of the same stuff in a new formulation over and over again.
In the time we have left, we've mostly talked about, cognitive consequences of using AI for the individual. Do you worry about any of the other things that people are concerned with? For example, mass job loss, the alignment problem, AI going rogue, any of those? Yeah,
I'm much more concerned about the questions of things like job loss than I am about the Terminator scenario. Mm-hmm. The way I always pitched my book was, I don't care about Terminator. I care about Idiocracy, or WALL-E, if you've ever seen that movie, right? I worry about all of us having our brains atrophy in terms of our ability to make good decisions. I'm not concerned about this thing developing its own brain and deciding all of us are
Sentience.
expendable. Yeah, sentience. I mean, and the people, the big minds in AI who've been working in it a long time are the ones saying that we're actually not on that path, that LLMs don't even take us there. They're not even in the right sort of category of technical architecture that would take us in that direction. Sam Altman and those guys would disagree, but that's an argument that's happening right now. Job loss, I worry about hugely, and I really worry about the sense. The thing that I worry about in the broader context around that is a sense of, which dovetails with your world, right? Is a sense of purpose and how important it is for human beings to have a sense of purpose, and how quickly the betrayal of that can lead to real trouble. I just the other week, again, just before Christmas, there was this big protest in India. Protest is not even really the word, but basically a big kind of a riot broke out at a stadium, a soccer stadium in Kolkata, where Lionel Messi came, the soccer superstar, came for a VIP experience. And the fans in that city were offered the chance, or all over India, were offered the chance to come and have VIP time with Lionel Messi in this soccer stadium. And they paid the equivalent of the average of about half of the average salary, weekly salary of an Indian knowledge worker. So big money, right? A very expensive thing. And he shows up, he's there for only about 20 minutes, and he's surrounded by dignitaries, so much so that nobody in the crowd can really catch a glimpse of him. And he leaves. And there's a total frickin' riot. They tear down the fences, they trash the field, the riot police have to be called in. People are so angry at this betrayal. And I think of that as an allegory for what is about to happen in India, because knowledge work is about to be wiped out. Customer service jobs, all the outsourced creative work, all of this stuff that India has been the English-speaking world's source for, it's about to get wiped out. And I think that, so I'm way more worried about the geopolitical consequences of, tens of millions of highly educated, hardworking Indian professionals suddenly going jobless than I am about, AI developing sentience and enslaving us all.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Before we go, for people who use LLMs, of course, many people are using them. They do have a lot of uses.
They do.
How do you think we should be using these sensibly? Are there any precautions you take, or do you think other people should take?
Well, so I think one thing is keep it in the realm of the professional. People I think are way too quick to, I know young people who come home from a date and run the date by their LLM to get their feedback, that kind of thing. And that is where I really worry about, I just think keep it out of that realm of your life. Instead, keep it professional. And as a research tool, I think it's an extraordinary thing. For me as a journalist, it's tremendous. When when the United States invades Venezuela, and I can't believe I'm saying those words out loud. That is what's where we're at.
That's where we're at.
I can very quickly look at every other historical example of a colonial power trying to go get somebody else's oil and it going terribly wrong, instantly. Right. Once upon a time, you had to write letters to get to a library to get the sources for that stuff. And so, it is amazing its capacity as a research tool. It's amazing its capacity as a scientific tool. I mean, in terms of just pattern recognition, being able to aim this thing at the stars or aim this thing at, unstructured, at every transcript of every patient interview ever done, incredible insights are going to come out of that. And I'm all for that. So my attitude is, I've always felt just give it to the scientists. Let the scientists use it for 5 years before you give us all AI girlfriends, what I mean? And so for me, it's keep it in the realm, keep it professional, keep it, treat it like a respected junior researcher whose work you have to double check. That's the attitude I try to take to it, because the more you try and bring it into anything emotional, it as an emotional support animal is where I think things start to go really wrong. So that's my personal rule about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think what I would add to that is to make sure you choose your discomforts carefully and keep discomfort in your life. It's very, very important. So do the hard work. If AI helps you on top of having done the hard work, if AI can help you further, that's fine. And obviously everyone will have to use their individual judgment about where the line is there. But the purpose of hard work isn't just to get the outcome. Oh, I've written this essay, or I've made this podcast or whatever. It's to keep your brain strong and hopefully make it stronger. And that's not just the hard work of like an academic task or a work task, but it's the hard work of being in a social situation when you don't feel like it, being bored, having to come up with a way to entertain yourself, new creative ideas. Your brain is always going to be the most important, piece of hardware you have, but it is that thing you need to keep training, and discomfort ultimately is friction, and discomfort is how you train it. There isn't really any other way, unfortunately.
Oh, I love that. I think that's good advice. I have to go speak to a group of parents in a couple of days who are all clamoring for advice on what to do with their children and their children's use of AI. And I love that idea. The work is its own reward in a way.
Yeah, I mean, to add to that, look, I gave a talk at the school last year. People are saying, what skills should my children learn, in the coming AI future? And I don't really know the answer to that. I don't have the ability to make those predictions. But I like to think of like the meta skills that humans have. What are the skills on top of the skills that are all based on? Delay gratification, like the ability to like push something into to get a delayed reward in the future.
Get 2 marshmallows.
To get 2 marshmallows. Focus, the ability to just focus on one thing until you reach a point of completion. Like social skills, all of these things, which if you can master those foundations, then hopefully your child can be then adaptable enough to deal with whatever scenario that's going to come up. I think one thing, so earlier you were talking about, what can AI replicate in terms of human behavior? And you said, can pretty much replicate everything. I think the one thing I think maybe it can't replicate is adaptability, like being thrown in a new situation and developing a new capacity in order to deal with that situation. I could be wrong, but I think my intuition is that's kind of a human thing so far. It may change in the future.
I like that. The what is that? The flexibility, the neuroplasticity of that. That's right.
Our brains do rewire themselves when faced with new situations, and LLMs fortunately don't do that yet. They may in some way in the future.
Wait a couple of quarters, but that's right. That's right.
Jacob, thank you so much for coming on. It's been wonderful to speak to you. We could talk for a few more hours, I bet, and we probably will at some point in the future. But
yes, I really appreciate this, Alex. Thank you so much for your perspective. I learned a lot.
Thank you.